family in the modern world. And as I had mentioned before, we're going to be talking today specifically about the Industrial Revolution. Because in a lot of ways, the Industrial Revolution is what has created our modern world. And we'll, of course, tie that in as we're considering the family. We're going to tie that in of how it has affected it. And I believe how it has affected it on a major and primary way is there is now, if you will, a lazy generation. That the Industrial Revolution, ironically, has actually made us more lazy. And that, of course, is going to affect the family as well. And so we're going to ask the question, why are we here? How have we gotten to this point? And so as we're considering the Industrial Revolution, I just want to give a little bit of background on that front in particular. This started somewhere around the around the 1750s, 1760s, and it went until the early 1900s. And the growing mentality of this day was we need to apply science to the growing world of industry and urbanization. And in a large part, urbanization would not have been possible. Tulsa would not have been possible if it were not for the Industrial Revolution. And so we saw the Industrial Revolution apply science to areas of transportation, of how production grew in that regard. That it took only 10 years for there be 90% of horse-drawn carriages to immediately 90% of automobiles on the roads. Only 10 years that it took for that to take place. You see it with textiles, and that just simply means how we make cloth and how that transformed drastically in this time period. And even with agriculture, and that's going to be important as we go into this discussion because agriculture was the economy before this time. And so what the Industrial Revolution was all about, it was all about production, efficiency, and getting things faster, better, and stronger. Faster, better, and stronger. That's what the Industrial Revolution was all about, to get stronger tools so that we could have better and faster production as well. And so again, the goal became really twofold under this umbrella of what I'm going to call efficiency. And it became that the primary goals of the Industrial Revolution were ease and production. Ease and production. They wanted to make something that improves our lives. Sounds like a noble goal in and of itself from the get-go. We like the idea of improving our lives. I think even there would be biblical precedent for that idea. But before, people primarily worked in two areas, agriculture and handicraft and trades. And what that means is simply like carpentry or areas such as textile type work. And all of this was on a handicraft or trade basis that you did as an individual. Again, like I said last week, companies didn't really exist before the Industrial Revolution. There were some, few and far between, but the idea of a company was so far from the mentality of people even just 300 years ago. The family was the economy. And in fact, before this time, they called it the home economy. Economy was the home. It wasn't this grand society picture before that time. But it was these two areas, agriculture and trades. And so you didn't have the idea of employees really at all, except for your family. Your family were your employees, and of course, slavery happened as well, though it wasn't nearly as evil and maniacal as we give it credit in our early American history. Though that certainly was evil and cruel. But families were the ones that worked together. And they worked together within the home. Your work either grew or it plummeted by the combined efforts of everyone in the home. And so 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10 is actually a key concept in that day whenever Paul is speaking to them. He's talking in a congregational sense when he says there that as we commanded you, if a man will not work, neither will he eat. If a man will not work, neither will he eat. Now again, he's talking in a congregational sense there, and he is saying that as a command that if someone is not going to work, then the church should not give him sustenance. The church should not provide for him. But there's also just a reality to that fact. That is a general truth, that if you're not going to work, then you're not going to eat either. And again, they rose or fell in the home. And so every act was not only for the home, but it was in the home before the Industrial Revolution. We looked quite a bit at Proverbs 31 last week. We're not going to take the time as much this week, but in Proverbs 31, we looked at everything that she did, and everything that the excellent wife did is now, because of the Industrial Revolution, faster and better. You don't have to go through the process of making your own yarn. You don't have to go through the process anymore of getting out the loom and making out some sort of fabric. You don't have to go through the process of cutting out a pattern and then sewing it together. That's something that you can do if you want to on your own spare time, but why would you if a company and a factory makes a shirt, for instance, in just a few minutes? Why would you do those jobs? And so things have become a lot faster because of the Industrial Revolution, and really better quality. I don't know if you've ever had a hand-spun shirt before, but it is not the most comfortable thing in the world. It's itchy, it's annoying. And so why would we continue to make those sort of things now that we're in post-Industrial Revolution? But that's not just true of the things that the wife did in the home, but it was also true for the husband as well. Because like I said a moment ago, and I didn't say the number, but I went back and looked, 80% of all people worked within their home before the Industrial Revolution. And so if we think in those terms of how even agriculture shifted, I said last week that I was going to purchase a cotton gin for us to destroy out in the parking lot after this lesson. I didn't get that, I apologize. But the idea of a cotton gin was something that made all the work so much faster. And the first thing we think is, well, how much easier that made it so that we didn't have to have slavery anymore. And I get that there was some benefit that came from it, but then we think about the person that didn't own slaves, the person that was just a farmer working his fields. And now, to work by hand is competing against the cotton gin. There's no way he could have competed with that idea. So people had to urbanize. They had to come into the cities to a large extent. And as I said last week, the question we never asked, and I'm not saying the question we never asked was, is this sinful? That's not the point of this. The question we never asked as a society was if this was an all-around better thing for families. If it was better for us to engage in production and ease. We think about cheaper financial costs. The Industrial Revolution definitely saved us from that. I want to be clear, I'm not a total Luddite that says, bash all technology, though AI may be at the top of that list. I'm not the type of Luddite that says that you can't have any sort of technology. I got a smartphone right here. And so I appreciate modern conveniences. I enjoy them, and I'm thankful for them. But the question we're asking is not just what was the financial cost. The financial cost dropped. The question we're asking today and through this series is, what about the spiritual and moral costs of going through this Industrial Revolution? What is the cost we paid as a society without realizing it? In Luke 14 and verse 31, I know he's talking about discipleship here, but he uses an illustration to help us understand the cost of discipleship. And he says in verse 31, or what king, when he sits out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down, again, this is forethought, thinking ahead, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. We never did that before the Industrial Revolution. We just started doing and producing and producing. And now we're dealing with the repercussions. And I believe the repercussions that we've gained is a lazy generation. What is the cost? What is the cost of production? And the idea of production here is the sense of that more is better. That if you have more of something, then it is better for society. But when production becomes the goal, it encourages several things and discourages other things. It encourages busy work. We talk about it all the time in our society today. Why has it come? Because we made production the goal. Pump out more. Have you ever heard of Parkinson's Law? Anyone heard of Parkinson's Law? Not Parkinson's disease, Parkinson's Law. You've probably heard of it without knowing the name. Parkinson's Law is the idea of that you will fill up all the time that you have with whatever it is that you're doing. And so in which case, if you only have 3 hours to do something, you will use that 3 hours. If you have 3 days to do something, you will use that same thing, you will use the entire 3 days to get it done, what you could have gotten done in 3 hours. And so this is the idea that if you give yourself less time, sometimes you actually wind up becoming more productive. Because often what we do is we procrastinate in those 2 days, and then the third day we're like, oh, I gotta get this done. Right? So production encourages busy work. We have to get more stuff out there, whether it's quality or not. I think a principle that goes along with that at least is 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 18. In 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 18, I know it's talking about spiritual gifts or a different context from that as well, but it says, I thank God I speak in tongues more than all of you. However, in the church, I desire to speak 5 words with my mind so that I may instruct others also rather than 10,000 words in a tongue. No, quantity is not always a better thing. And so the idea here is that as long as there is perceived work being done, then there's value in that. When production becomes the goal, you encourage busy work. When production becomes the goal, as the Industrial Revolution was, you encourage long hours. Why? Because you're pushing quotas, trying to get more and more out there, and so you have to work longer and longer hours to get that job done. And I want us to consider Ecclesiastes chapter 4. If you want to put your marker in Ecclesiastes, we're going to come back to it later in the lesson. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and in verse 5, it says, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after wind. Did you know that it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we came up with the phrase work-life balance? And the reason why is because some people really didn't get that concept. So we started working longer and longer hours. That today, the average amount of time that a man gets with his children is 1 hour a day. We have 16 waking hours, generally speaking, and a man generally gets 1 hour a day on average with his kids. Why? Because you're working longer and longer hours. And so men became exhausted in the Industrial Revolution. Because the idea of a company, the idea of production, was never designed to lift you up and energize you. It was intended to get all the energy out of you. And sometimes even more than your energy. I'm sure you've heard the song at least, 16 Tongues. The idea there was that I owe my soul to the company store. Because not only were they taking all your energy, but they were taking all of your finances as well, that you had to pay the company store, the people that you work for, in order to get any resources at all for your family. It was never designed to energize. It was designed to pull the energy out of you. So when men did get off work, where did they go? Especially in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, they went to the bars. because the alcohol seemed to be the only answer to be able to finally relax from the stress and the exhaustion that I gave over to the company for all those hours before. So when you got home, that combo of exhaustion and being drunk, it did not go well. Did you know that women were the ones that pushed prohibition in the 1920s? And the reason why is because they felt like they had lost their men and they just wanted their men back. Can you blame them for that? Now, of course, prohibition didn't go so well. The men started uprising instead of going away from the bars and the brothels. When production becomes the goal, you encourage long hours. There are only so many hours in our day. We say this all the time. Because there is only so much that we can produce. If I could use preaching as an example for a moment. Because while all of this was happening with the Industrial Revolution, and the idea here was production, the same thing happened for preachers as well. The congregations expected the preacher to put out as much product as they put out whenever they're working in their companies as well. There are three major areas that a preacher needs to be able to focus on in order to be effective: preaching, evangelism, and their family. If it is that they have one. Not all do, of course. But those are the three areas that if they are going to be faithful as a minister of Christ, Paul says you need to be effective in those three areas. But what happened? With the Industrial Revolution, as everyone was thinking about long hours and pushing quotas, that happened for the preachers as well. They expected them to work long hours at the office. They expected them to have 4 thorough lessons every single week with 2 sermons and 2 Bible classes. On top of that, to have a full bulletin every week. And on top of that, to have a radio program whenever radio came around. And on top of that, to be able to visit Aunt Marge on the weekends because she's sick. There was one person that did a study just of his eldership one time. And by the way, I want to put a side note. The elders have always been very gracious to me to allow me to have some sort of flexibility. They have specifically said, we don't want you to have to teach 2 classes every week because we want you to be able to work in these other areas as well. And so I'm very grateful for the stance that the elders take on that and other areas in this regard. But not all churches have done that. And they have squelched a lot of the energy of their preachers. And so as production became big even within preachers, we usually saw one of these 3 areas suffer. Some men opted for the preaching to suffer, that they didn't get deep into the text, but instead they did what I sometimes call Strong's Concordance sermons. That all they did is they went through and they said, okay, here's every verse on faith, and I'm going to do a lesson on faith. And now I'm going to do a lesson on baptism. And they only ever talked about Bible basics. And that was because they were letting the preaching suffer. The Hebrew writer makes clear, Bible basics cannot be the steady diet of a congregation. You need to get deep into the Word. It is something that you need to refresh on, but it is not something that you need to delve on deeply all the time. But that's what preaching became during this time period. That Bible basics didn't become just the only preaching that happened. It became the preaching that congregations became attuned to, that they thought those were the best sermons. So sometimes they let the preaching suffer. Sometimes preachers opted for the evangelism to suffer. I would say probably that's what fell first, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. To the extent that now we have a term called a pulpit minister, or a pulpit preacher. That did not exist before the Industrial Revolution. And the idea is I don't do evangelism, I leave that to other folks. I'm the pulpit guy. I work in the pulpit. So they let the evangelism suffer, and congregations dwindled because of it. Then there's a third. Some preachers opted for their families to suffer. That some of the big name preachers that you think of maybe today, or in the past. Or not even just big name preachers, but more preachers than used to be, I think. They lost their children because there weren't enough hours in the day. There's a cost. There's a cost to production. And then when long hours become the badge of honor, families, like we just said, suffer. That we think in terms of how hard you work is only seen by how many hours you work. That you work harder than someone else because you work 80 hours a week versus someone who works 40 hours a week. Now, to be clear, I'm never in this conversation going to encourage that we go to like 20-hour weeks or something like that so we can have time for other things. I'm going to say just the opposite. I think we need to be working more, but in different areas. But as we think about this, long hours became a badge of honor, and if you work longer hours at your company, what time is left for your family? And even if you do get that 1 hour on average with your family, what do you want to do with them? Play and have fun. That especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it became a stereotype of men that when they came home, the first thing they did was they plopped on the couch and they watched sports. It became a stereotype because that's what was happening. They didn't want to come home and work more. They wanted to come home and relax. And so what does that mean for the kids? The only time that they saw their fathers was when they weren't working. And they never got the example of working hard themselves. Working hard is what happens when dad leaves. When he comes home, Bluey's dad, the thing he does is he has fun whenever he comes home. I love Bluey, don't get me wrong. But that is what we've come to. That is what happens at home, is leisure and ease. Which, of course, leads us to the next point. But I do want to put this in before we get there. When you put a dollar amount on your production, because before the Industrial Revolution, we didn't really give salaries in that traditional kind of way that we think of it today. But when you put a dollar amount on your production, it affected how we view value. And I believe James chapter 2 says very clearly how we should not put value to whether or not you are rich or poor to people. But that's exactly what happened because of the Industrial Revolution. When the Industrial Revolution happened, if you were a CEO, not only did you have a higher paycheck, but since you had a higher paycheck, you must be a more valuable person than the construction worker. And when we think of construction work, we think of that as being the low, menial task that you want to make sure your kids go to college so they don't get stuck in that for the rest of their life. The value amount changed whenever we put a dollar amount to the production. But who did that hurt the worst? Homemakers. Because they were making no salary. You think that didn't affect how she saw her work and her life's value? That she was bringing nothing into the home? The Industrial Revolution did that. In fact, feminists specifically said that out loud in the 1920s. They were saying, we have no value working in the home. We're going to talk, at least in a couple of lessons here, how that is not how God sees it. But that's how our society has brought us. Precious far above rubies? We think, no way. Not with the job we're seeing here in Proverbs 31. And then we need to talk about the cost of ease. Ease, leisure. What was the cost of us producing things that made our life easier? I want to say this first. When you remove the burden of work, you also remove the benefits of the burden. Again, when you remove the burden of work, you also remove the benefits of the burden. Back over in Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 10, we know this well. It says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. There is effort involved with work. There is a burden that is involved with work. We call it labor for a reason. And back in chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, chapter 2 and verse 22, it says, for what does a man get in all of his labor and his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because of all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. Now he uses it in this early chapters to talk about what am I supposed to do? What's the purpose of life? But notice the next verse. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. Work, labor, effort. The opposite things of ease are the things that Solomon says, those are a blessing from God. We need the burden sometimes. We need the effort. But instead what we do is we want to make each subsequent generation have an easier life. We want our kids to have an easier life. We talked about this recently in Judges chapter 3, but I want to suggest that that's not always the best thing. In Judges chapter 3 and in verse 1, Judges 3 and in verse 1, Judges 3 verse 1, it says, now these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them. That is, all who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan, only in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war, those who had not experienced it formerly. We think I want our kids' lives to be easier. Benjamin Franklin is quoted as saying that I am going to study war and strategy so that my kids can study mathematics and engineering. That's how he thought in terms of. He wanted the kids' life to be easier. And we get that on one front. We do want our kids' life to be easier if we're going through turmoil. But God said, I actually want the next generation to experience war. And the reason I want them to experience war is so they will learn to trust me. Sometimes there's actually a downside for our kids' lives being easier than our own. Maybe sometimes we need more difficulty. So as we're thinking about the cost of ease in particular, the cost of ease, for one, is that we remove motivation. That's one of the benefits of burden. We remove motivation whenever we have things easier for us. So, for instance, there is actually studies that have been conducted concerning dopamine. Dopamine in the past we thought was the pleasure center of the brain, but we've realized that that's not actually the case. Dopamine is actually the motivation center of the brain. And the only reason that dopamine is activated, unless you're going to do dopamine floods, like viewing inappropriate things on the internet or something like that, that's the only other way that you're going to get a dopamine hit. And that's why we thought it was the pleasure center. But what people are coming to realize is that it is the motivation center. And so what happens is when you go through deep effort, we sometimes see this as, you've maybe heard the phrase, a runner's high. Phil, you heard that phrase before? That is dopamine hitting the brain because you have gone through a deep amount of effort to finally get to a point of whatever the mile marker may be. You've gotten to that point and your brain is flooded with dopamine. And what it does is it motivates you to go to the next difficult task, and then the next difficult task, and the next difficult task. But if you remove the difficulty, then what does that do? Well, it makes you into a person like in Proverbs 26. In Proverbs 26, and in verse 13, Proverbs 26 and verse 13 beginning. It says, the sluggard, or the lazy man, says, there is a lion in the road. A lion is in the open square. As the door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He is weary of bringing it to his mouth again. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can give a discreet answer, or answer wisely. You get to that kind of point, If you remove the difficult effort, then you remove the motivation as well, that you're not even willing to lift your hand from your plate to eat. I think to a large extent we've come to that. We encourage or we remove motivation. The way you encourage is working less. When you build things and you make things that make life easier, it encourages us to want easier things as well. So for instance, it's already easy enough to take a sponge and wipe a dish clean. That's easy enough. We even have a dishwasher. We're going to make your life even just slightly more easier by putting a two-sided scrub and a happy face on it and say this is going to make your life 1% easier, right? And so the only things that we invent today are things that make your life just slightly easier because we've already dealt with the big things. The cotton gin's been invented. The tractor has been invented. The factories have been invented. The air conditioning has been invented. We've dealt with the big things, and now we have to go with the small things to make your life even easier and easier for that production that we're putting out. For example, of what that's led to. School has not been quite rigorous for a long time now. Basically, all you need to do to get through high school is have breath in your lungs. It's not that hard like it used to be, maybe. I can attest to it because I went through the system as well. And so it's becoming easier and easier because we even are thinking of our kids in terms of the Industrial Revolution, that we got to get our product through the assembly line. Just get them through high school, and then they will live their life according to however we need them to live it. I'm not saying you have to homeschool. I'm just saying that this is what our society has come to. And so what that leaves for the children, if school is pretty easy, what that leaves for the children is plenty of time for Fortnite. You can spend all your time playing games when you get home. And so what that makes work is the brief interruption between living real life, which is having fun, and taking leisure. But that's how we think even as adults today. That we think in terms of work as the brief interruption so that I can get to my real life of fun in the Bahamas. And if you don't believe me on this, have you heard of the book 4 Hour Workweek? It's one that in the productivity sphere is a huge hit right now. Because that book is trying to say that we need to have more leisure and fun time. And so isn't it more profitable for us to be able to make $10,000 by only working 4 hours a week versus having to do that in a 40-hour work week? And so if we can have that 4-hour work week, then we can have the fun things that life is really about. We've instilled this in our minds today. Another cost of ease is we encourage self-interest. When are you going to get my AC fixed? Oh, the Amazon package isn't going to get here till Thursday? Come on. This is how we think. We want things to just be easy for us. And when any of those things of ease break, our minds go nuts. And in this idea of going nuts is often motivated by selfish motives. Can I give you a recent example? When the shutdown started in 2020, what was the thing that flew off the shelves? Toilet paper. That whenever we thought in terms of, oh, everything's shutting down, I need something, it's toilet paper. And I need to make sure that I get enough so that it lasts me for the next 20 years at the expense of whatever anyone else needs. I need to get the product off the shelf for me. Boy, if anything worse than 2020 were to ever to happen, I fear for what those shelves and what those people would look like. The cost of ease is self-interest. Now again, modern conveniences give us comfort, but if we don't train our children properly, it's going to spoil them. In James chapter 3, and in verse 13, James 3 and verse 13. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior, his deeds, and the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every earthly thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed which is born in righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Not selfish interests, not, as he calls it here, earthly, natural, demonic interests that look inwardly, but it's pure motives. We have to instill that wisdom from God that God teaches in our children's hearts, lest they see all around them that this ease is just handed to me on a silver platter. They called my generation the entitled generation for a reason. Not because all of us are, but there's quite a bit of us who are. That's a product and a cost of ease. And in Luke chapter 6 and verse 24, Luke chapter 6 and verse 24, this is I'm not going to say truncated, that's not the right word, but it is a parallel to the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. It is shorter, but it maybe punches a little harder on a couple of points. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 24, Jesus says this, "Woe to you who are rich, for you are receiving your comfort in full. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep." Ease is not always a blessing. Jesus describes it sometimes as a curse. And Isaiah does the same thing, Isaiah or Jeremiah, where he says, "Woe to you women who are at ease." Same kind of language. Ease is not always the best thing for us because we start thinking inwardly. And finally, the cost of ease, we discourage gratitude for basic needs. In contrast, of course, to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and in verse 16 beginning. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and in verse 16. It says, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." Rain doesn't really affect me anymore, not like it did 300 years ago. I never have a shortage of bread unless I'm in Alabama whenever a slight chance of ice is coming. I never have a shortage of these things, and so often what that means is that I'm not really grateful for them. That it's become almost common in contrast to centuries before, where every single meal Christians would say thanks to the Lord. And now sometimes it feels like pulling teeth whenever you come together at a restaurant with fellow Christians, that they take those first few bites and then, "Hey, do you mind if we say thanks first?" I believe a lot of that is the product of us not really being grateful for the things that we take for granted. Like a hot meal that we can just pay $30 for and it'll be ready in 20 minutes. This is the result of a privileged society. I have a right to this. And when you combine ease, a society of ease, and a society of rights, which is what America is, it's a dangerous combination for gratitude. Ease and production. That's what the Industrial Revolution brought us. Relentless production and the resulting easy life that comes from it. The reason I'm talking about this so thoroughly here is because it took away so many functions of the family unit. And I've touched on that here, but I want us to actually see it fully fleshed out here now that we can take that as a foundation and talk about that in the home particularly. We don't need to work together as a family really as much as they used to, because someone else bakes my bread. Someone else makes my t-shirts. Someone else builds my houses. Working together has been lost in our generation. And in fact, sometimes working hard at all has been lost too. Guys, it's not just Gen Z who is the lazy generation. All of us have become a lazy generation. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone here specifically. I'm talking about society. We have become a lazy generation, and we've all accepted the status quo of relative ease. Now, I don't think that's changing, but the question I want us to ask is, how do we buy back hard work and united effort for our families in the home when so much of that has been lost to our culture? We're going to discuss that next week. And that lesson title is going to be Piety at Home. Not a word we often use, but I think is pivotal as we're drawing from the scriptures. What is to happen in the home? Piety. Think about the definition of that this next week. As we close out, we want to extend an invitation to anyone here who is in need of the Lord's forgiveness. Now, that may mean that there has been some sort of private sin that you have engaged in, and you need to repent before God. And maybe you even need our prayers because it has become so pervasive in your life. Maybe you need the prayers of the saints and the forgiveness of this congregation because you've done something of a public nature that has brought reproach against God's people. And if we can pray for you in that regard, please come to the front. But if there is anyone here who has not become a child of God and is ready to obey the love of Christ, as was talked about before the Lord's Supper, if you are ready to become obedient to Christ's love and his mercy, do so by repenting and being baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, even today, as we stand and as we sing.